The San Diego sun beat down mercilessly on Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, turning the already brutal SEAL training grounds into something that felt like the surface of Mars. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had been awake for 72 hours straight, her body operating on nothing but adrenaline, protein bars, and the sheer force of will that had gotten her through the Naval Academy with honors. But, she was learning, had its limits. Move it, Mitchell. My grandmother crawls faster than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. The instructor's voice cut through the fog in her brain as she dragged herself to the mud under barbed wire, her arms trembling with exhaustion. She could hear some of the male recruits behind her, their whispers carrying on the ocean breeze, despite their attempts at discretion. She's not going to make it. What did they expect, letting women in? This is embarrassing to watch. Sarah gritted her teeth and pushed forward. She'd dealt with doubt her entire life. From her father, a retired Navy captain who'd wanted sons. From her brothers, who'd treated her like a fragile doll. From every person who'd ever told her that some things just weren't meant for women. She'd proven them all wrong before. She could do it again. But the human body has limits that determination cannot override. It happened during the pool evolution, the underwater knot-tying exercise that tested recruits' ability to stay calm while oxygen deprived. Sarah dove down, her fingers working the rope even as her lungs began to burn. 15 seconds. 30. 45. The knot was almost complete. Just a few more seconds. The edges of her vision began to darken. Her fingers fumbled. And then, nothing. She woke up on the pool deck. Instructor surrounding her, water streaming from her nose and mouth. The medical officer was shining a light in her eyes. "Lieutenant Mitchell, can you hear me?" The shame hit her before the oxygen fully returned to her brain. She'd failed. She'd actually failed. "I'm fine," she croaked, trying to sit up. "Let me go back in. I can do it." "You're done for today, Mitchell," the senior instructor said, not unkindly. "Medical needs to clear you." That night in the barracks, she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, every muscle in her body screaming. She could hear the whispers from the other recruits, louder now that they thought she was asleep. Did you see her face when they pulled her out? Pathetic. I give her another week, max. She's going to get someone killed if they let her continue. The next morning, Sarah reported to the medical facility. The doctor, a weathered Navy veteran with kind eyes, examined her thoroughly. "Lieutenant, your body is shutting down. Your cortisol levels are dangerously elevated. You're severely dehydrated despite 4 fluids, and your muscle enzymes indicate rhabdomyolysis. If you continue training in this condition, you could suffer permanent kidney damage or worse." "How long until I can return?" Sarah asked, her jaw set. "Minimum 2 weeks medical leave. But honestly, I'd recommend you reconsider whether this is the right path for you. 2 weeks. In SEAL training, that might as well be 2 years. She'd have to roll back to a new class, start over with recruits who hadn't seen her fail. Or worse, she could be dropped entirely." The decision was made for her 3 days later when she collapsed again during physical therapy. This time, she didn't wake up for 6 hours. When she did, Captain Morrison was sitting beside her hospital bed. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said gravely, "you've given this everything you have. No one questions your courage or your commitment, but your body is telling you something you need to hear." "Sir, I can do this. Just give me more time." "You're being medically withdrawn from training," he interrupted gently. "It's not a failure, Sarah. You push yourself to the absolute limit. That takes more strength than most people will ever have." But it felt like failure. It felt like every person who'd ever doubted her had been right all along. The worst part came when she had to return to the base to collect her belongings. Walking through the compound, she could feel the eyes on her, some sympathetic, but others satisfied, vindicated. "There goes the girl who couldn't hack it," she heard someone say. "Knew she wouldn't last." Another voice added with barely concealed glee. In the administration building, she ran into a group of newly minted SEALs, men who completed training while she'd been in medical. One of them, a cocky operator named Jake Thornton, actually laughed when he saw her. "Hey, guys, remember the girl who thought she could be a SEAL?" He called out to his buddies, loud enough for everyone in the corridor to hear. What was it, Mitchell? The pool too deep for you? His friend snickered. Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation, but she kept her head high and walked past without responding. Engaging would only make it worse. That's right. Just walk away, Thornton called after her. It's what you do best. The laughter followed her all the way to her car. Over the following weeks, Sarah learned that military bases were small worlds where reputation spread faster than wildfire. The girl who quit became a cautionary tale, a punchline, a reason to keep women out of special operations. She heard it whispered in the commissary, saw the smirks in the gym, felt the judgment in every interaction. What no one knew, what no one could know, was that Sarah Mitchell hadn't quit at all. 2 days after her medical withdrawal, she'd received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. A voice she'd never heard before asked her a single question. Lieutenant Mitchell, how would you like to try again? Differently this time. The voice belonged to someone from a program, so classified it didn't have a name. A program that needed someone with her exact combination of skills, determination, and now apparent failure. Because sometimes the most valuable operators were the ones everyone had already written off. Sarah had said yes without hesitation. For the next 8 months, she disappeared. Her family was told she'd taken a position with Naval Intelligence at a desk job in Norfolk. A cover story that played perfectly into everyone's expectations of where the failed SEAL recruit had ended up. In reality, she was at a facility that didn't exist on any map, undergoing training that made Hell Week look like a vacation. She learned things that SEALs never learned. Languages, advanced intelligence gathering, psychological operations, close protection for the highest levels of government, and yes, combat skills that went far beyond what conventional special operations required. But she also learned patience, humility, the value of being underestimated. Her instructors in this shadow program were unlike anyone she'd met in the regular military. They didn't care about gender, ego, or proving points. They cared about one thing. Could you do the job when everything depended on it? Sarah could. By the time her training was complete, she'd been promoted to lieutenant commander and given a position that would have seemed impossible for someone with her public record. She became the executive protection officer for Admiral James Mitchell, her own father, who'd been appointed to a classified position overseeing special operations integration. The irony wasn't lost on her. The father who'd never believed she could cut it in combat operations was now protected by her skills every single day, without knowing it. And then came the invitation to the SEAL graduation ceremony at Coronado. The ceremony where Jake Thornton and his entire team would be receiving commendations for a recent operation. The ceremony where Sarah would accompany her father as his unobtrusive shadow. The junior officer no one would look at twice. When Sarah received the orders, she'd smile for the first time in months. Sometimes the universe had a sense of timing. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright over Coronado, the kind of perfect San Diego day that appeared in recruiting commercials. The ceremony grounds had been meticulously prepared. White chairs arranged in precise rows, a stage decorated with American flags and the Navy SEAL trident, and a reviewing stand where distinguished guests would observe the proceedings. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell arrived 2 hours before the scheduled start time, as protocol demanded for executive protection details. She wore her dress whites, her ribbons modest compared to the combat decorations many of the SEALs would be sporting. To anyone glancing her way, she looked like exactly what her cover identity suggested. A mid-level intelligence officer assigned to administrative duties, the kind of person who existed in the background of military ceremonies without anyone really noticing. That was precisely the point. She'd spent the drive from her hotel mentally preparing herself for this moment. She would see Jake Thornton today. She would see all the men who'd mocked her, who'd turned her medical withdrawal into a joke, who'd spread the story of the girl who quit throughout the special operations community. And they would have no idea who she'd become. Mitchell. Her father's voice crackled through her earpiece. She still wasn't used to calling him Admiral on duty, even though she'd done it her entire life. I'm departing the residence now. ETA 15 minutes. Copy that, sir, she replied professionally. Venue is secure. Route is clear. Admiral James Mitchell had aged in the 2 years since Sarah had last seen him in person. Their relationship had been strained since her childhood. A distant father who'd been deployed more than he'd been home, who'd measured love in expectations rather than words. When she'd been withdrawn from SEAL training, he'd sent a brief email. Unfortunate, but probably for the best. Not everyone is cut out for that life. She'd never responded. He didn't know that his executive protection officer was his daughter. The program had made sure of that. As far as Admiral Mitchell knew, Lieutenant Commander S., Mitchell was a random junior officer assigned to a security detail, someone he'd met only in passing during official briefings. Her appearance had changed enough. Shorter hair, different bearing, the weight she'd lost and then gained back as muscle, that his brief glances at her never sparked recognition. Sometimes Sarah wondered what he would say if he knew. Would he be proud? Would he understand why she'd never told him? Would it matter? She pushed the thoughts aside. Personal feelings had no place on duty. The ceremony grounds began filling up 90 minutes before start time. Families arrived first. Parents, siblings, children, wives, and girlfriends, all dressed in their finest, carrying flowers and cameras and barely contained pride. Then came the dignitaries, local politicians, senior military officers, representatives from allied nations' special operations forces, and finally, the SEALs themselves. They arrive in formation, their dress whites crisp, their bearing confident. These were men who completed the hardest military training in the world. They'd earned the right to walk with their heads high. Sarah watched from her position near the VIP section, her eyes hidden behind regulation sunglasses, her face professionally neutral. She spotted Jake Thornton immediately. He was impossible to miss, his chest heavy with ribbons from a recent deployment that had earned his team the special commendation ceremony. He was laughing with his teammates, the same cocky grin she remembered from that humiliating day in the administration building. Some of the other men from that group were with him, too, the ones who'd laughed at his jokes about her, who'd spread the story of her failure. "Remember Mitchell?" she heard Thornton say as his group passed relatively near her position. "That chick who tried to make it through training? Washed out after, 5 weeks? 6. Another SEAL corrected. Passed out in the pool like a little kid." "Where do you think she is now?" someone asked. "Probably pushing papers somewhere, telling everyone how she almost made it." The laughter carried across the ceremony grounds. Several people turned to look, including some family members who frowned at the inappropriate behavior before a formal ceremony. Sarah felt a familiar burn in her chest. Not shame this time, but something colder, more controlled. She'd learned in her training that anger was a tool, not a weakness. Used properly, it sharpened focus instead of clouding it. All stations, Admiral arriving in 3 minutes. She spoke quietly into her mic, alerting the security team. As her father's motorcade pulled up to the VIP entrance, Sarah moved into position, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. This was perhaps the strangest part of her new role. Protecting a man she'd spent years resenting, a man who'd never believed in her, a man who represented everything she'd been fighting against her entire military career. But he was also her assignment, and she'd never failed an assignment since joining the program. Admiral Mitchell emerged from a vehicle, his uniform immaculate, his bearing every inch the senior officer he'd become. He nodded briefly to Sarah and the other security personnel before moving toward the VIP seating area, where he would sit with other senior leaders. The ceremony began with the national anthem. Sarah stood at rigid attention, her hand over her heart, her mind focused on her security responsibilities, even as a familiar note stirred something deep in her chest. Whatever complicated feelings she had about her father, about the Navy, about everything that had happened, she'd never stopped loving this. The ceremony, the tradition, the idea of service that transcended individual glory. The base commander took the podium first, delivering opening remarks about the exceptional men being honored today. Then came several shorter speeches from other dignitaries, each praising the SEALs' courage, skill, and dedication. Sarah barely listened. She was watching the crowd, the perimeter, the roof lines of nearby buildings, watching for anything out of place, any threat to the principles she was protecting. But she was also, in some small part of her awareness, watching Jake Thornton and his team, watching them bask in the recognition, watching them receive the praise, she'd once dreamed of earning. The irony was that she'd done things in the past 8 months that would merit decorations far beyond what these SEALs were receiving today. But her decorations were classified. Her operations didn't exist on any official record. Her successes were measured in threats neutralized, principles protected, missions completed that the public would never know had happened. She'd made her peace with that. Recognition wasn't why she served. The ceremony continued with individual commendations being read aloud. When Jake Thornton's name was called, the applause was thunderous. He strode confidently to the stage, shaking hands with the base commander, accepting his award with the perfect blend of humility and pride that the moment demanded. Sarah had to admit, grudgingly, that he was good at this part. The public face of special operations. The warrior hero that made great headlines and recruiting materials. What he wasn't good at, apparently, was knowing when to keep his mouth shut. During the brief reception that followed the formal ceremony portion, Sarah maintained her position near Admiral Mitchell while he networked with other senior officers. She could hear fragments of their conversations, discussions about budgets, operational tempo, the challenges of maintaining readiness in a changing strategic environment. But she could also hear Jake Thornton and his teammates, who'd gravitated toward the refreshment area where many of the junior personnel had congregated. This is what real SEALs look like, Thornton was saying, loudly enough to carry across the area. Not people who fold under pressure and wash out because the pool was too scary. His friends laughed. Several other personnel within earshot looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Challenging a SEAL, especially one who'd just been publicly decorated, wasn't something most junior officers were eager to do. Some people just aren't built for this life, Thornton continued, apparently on a roll. They should figure that out before wasting everyone's time and resources. Remember that chick who... Lieutenant Thornton, a voice cut across his speech. It was Captain Morrison, one of the training officers who'd been present during Sarah's medical withdrawal. A word, please. Thornton's expression flickered with annoyance before he schooled it into respectful acknowledgement. Of course, sir. But as Morrison drew him aside, Sarah could see Thornton's body language, the subtle resistance, the barely concealed eye roll shared with his teammates. He was being reprimanded, but he didn't take it seriously. Why would he? He was decorated, successful, exactly the kind of SEAL the Navy showcased. Her failure had been real. His mockery of it had consequences for exactly no one except her. Sarah checked her watch. The reception would continue for another 40 minutes, and then the formal portion of the event would conclude. After that, many of the SEALs and their families would head to private celebrations at local restaurants and bars. Her shift would end when Admiral Mitchell departed. She'd head back to her hotel, file her security report, and probably catch a late flight back to Norfolk. That would have been the end of it. Just another day of watching the men who'd mocked to receive praise while she existed in the background, except for what was scheduled to happen at the ceremony's conclusion. A special presentation that even most of the attendees didn't know about yet. A presentation that was about to change everything. Sarah felt her phone buzz with an encrypted message. 12 minutes out. Prepare for arrival. She allowed herself the smallest smile. The universe's sense of timing, apparently, was even better than she'd thought. The first hint that something unexpected was happening came 11 minutes after Sarah received the encrypted message. The casual chat of the reception was interrupted by a distant sound, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of helicopter rotors cutting through the air. At first, no one paid much attention. Coronado was a naval base. Helicopters came and went constantly, but this sound was growing louder, and it was approaching the ceremony grounds directly, which wasn't standard procedure during official events. Sarah watched as heads began to turn toward the sky. Several of the SEALs, their instincts honed by years of operations, automatically assessed the incoming aircraft. Even Jake Thornton paused in his conversation, shading his eyes to look upward. That's a VH-60, someone near Sarah muttered. White top variant. White top, the designation for helicopters used by the most senior levels of government and military leadership. Sarah saw Admiral Mitchell glance toward her with a questioning look. She gave him the subtle hand signal they'd rehearsed. Expected arrival, no threat. The base commander hurried toward the podium, clearly caught off guard. His aide was frantically checking a tablet, trying to figure out what was happening. Whatever this was, it hadn't been on the official ceremony schedule. The helicopter, a pristine white and blue V-60N, descended toward the open area adjacent to the ceremony grounds, its rotor wash sending napkins and programs flying, forcing people to shield their eyes and turn away. It touched down with practiced precision, and the rotors began to slow. Ladies and gentlemen, the base commander's voice came over the PA system, uncertain but maintaining composure. It appears we have an additional distinguished guest arriving. Please remain in your positions. Jake Thornton laughed and said something to his teammates that Sarah couldn't hear but could easily imagine. Probably a joke about the brass always needing to make a dramatic entrance, or some comment about the politics of military ceremonies. The helicopter door opened, and a two-person security detail emerged first. Professionals Sarah recognized immediately as members of her own program, though she'd never worked with them directly. They took positions on either side of the aircraft, their eyes scanning the crowd with a kind of efficiency that spoke to training few people received. Then a woman, in a Navy dress uniform, stepped down from the helicopter. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the reaction ripple through the crowd. The woman wore the uniform of a rear admiral, two silver stars gleaming on her shoulder boards. But what drew every eye wasn't her rank. It was her bearing. She moved with the controlled precision of someone who'd spent time in special operations, combined with the polished confidence of senior leadership. As she walked toward the ceremony grounds, Sarah could see more details. The woman appeared to be in her early 50s, fit and commanding, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her ribbon rack was extensive but largely classified. Most people wouldn't recognize the decorations, but those who did would know they indicated a career spent in the shadows. Admiral Patricia Keene, director of a joint special operations program so classified that even its existence was need to know, the person who'd recruited Sarah, the person who'd overseen her training, the person who'd signed off on every mission Sarah had completed over the past 8 months, and the person who, Sarah suddenly realized with crystal clarity, was about to blow her cover for reasons she could only begin to guess. The base commander descended from the stage to greet Admiral Keene, his expression somewhere between confused and concerned. They spoke briefly, too quietly for the crowd to hear, but Sarah could read the base commander's body language. Surprise, then understanding, then something like apprehension. He returned to the podium, and Admiral Keene moved to stand near the VIP section, her security detail maintaining discreet positions nearby. "Ladies and gentlemen," the base commander announced, "we have an unscheduled but very welcome addition to today's ceremony. It is my honor to introduce Rear Admiral Patricia Keene, who has requested the opportunity to make a brief presentation." The applause was polite but uncertain. Most people in the crowd had no idea who Admiral Keene was, and those who didn't know weren't entirely sure what her presence here meant. Admiral Keene took the podium with the ease of someone who briefed presidents and cabinet officials. Her voice was clear and carried authority without being harsh. "Thank you, Commander. I apologize for the dramatic entrance. It wasn't my intention to overshadow this important ceremony honoring these exceptional SEALs." She paused, and Sarah saw her eyes scan the crowd until they landed on Jake Thornton and his team. "But I'm here today to address something that I believe demands immediate attention." The ceremony grounds had gone completely silent. Even the SEALs who'd been talking among themselves were now focused intently on the Admiral. 8 months ago, Admiral Keene continued, a young officer was medically withdrawn from SEAL training after pushing herself past the point of physical collapse. This officer's withdrawal became, unfortunately, a source of mockery and derision among some members of the special operations community. She was referred to as the girl who quit. Sarah felt her heart begin to pound. Where was this going? Jake Thornton's face had lost some of its color. Several of his teammates were glancing at each other nervously. What those who mocked her didn't know, Admiral Keene said, her voice taking on an edge of steel, was that this officer's failure had caught the attention of a program I oversee, a program that specifically recruits individuals who have demonstrated exceptional ability, but who may not fit the conventional mold of special operations. She paused, letting that sink in. What they also didn't know was that this officer spent the past 8 months completing training that makes Hell Week look like a warm-up exercise. Training that fewer than 10% of candidates complete successfully. Training that prepared her for missions I cannot describe in an open setting like this. Admiral Keene's eyes swept across the crowd again. During the past 8 months, while some people were repeating jokes about her supposed failure, this officer was on operations in 3 different countries. She personally protected 2 cabinet secretaries and 1 allied head of state. She identified and helped neutralize a threat to a classified military facility. She performed her duties with such exceptional skill that she earned the highest possible evaluation ratings from every assessment team. Sarah could see Jake Thornton's face had gone from pale to red. He wasn't the only one. Several other SEALs were looking distinctly uncomfortable. This officer, Admiral Keene continued, is an example of something we need to remember in the special operations community, that there are many forms of excellence, many ways to serve at the highest levels, and that sometimes what looks like failure is actually the first step toward a different kind of success. The Admiral stepped back from the podium slightly. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, would you please join me here? For a moment, Sarah couldn't move. Her cover was about to be completely blown in front of hundreds of people, including her father, including every person who'd mocked her. But she was a professional. She'd received an order from a superior officer. She moved. Walking toward the podium felt surreal. She could feel every eye in the audience following her. She could see the exact moment when recognition hit Jake Thornton's face. His expression cycling through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been fear. She could see other faces too. SEALs who'd been present during her training. Officers who'd seen her withdrawal. Family members of other service members who were trying to understand what was happening. And she could see her father, Admiral James Mitchell, his face registering shock as he finally recognized a junior officer who'd been shadowing him for months. Sarah reached the podium and stood at attention beside Admiral Keene. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Keene said, "I present to you Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, not the girl who quit. A highly decorated officer who serves her country in ways most people will never know about. An officer who has earned every bit of respect that anyone in this audience has earned, and then some." The applause started slowly, hesitant, uncertain, but then built as a reality of what Admiral Keene had said sank in. Some of the SEAL families were the loudest, particularly the women who understood exactly what Sarah's journey meant. But Sarah wasn't watching the crowd anymore. She was watching one specific person. Her father had risen from his seat. He was walking toward the podium, his expression unreadable. Admiral Keene saw him approaching and smiled slightly. "Admiral Mitchell, I believe you know Lieutenant Commander Mitchell?" "Aye." James Mitchell's voice caught. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. "I didn't know. How did I not know?" "It was classified, sir," Sarah said formally, though her voice was softer than regulation required. "For operational security reasons, your protection detail couldn't disclose." "You've been protecting me," he interrupted, the realization dawning. "These past months. You've been right there, and I didn't even recognize my own daughter." The word hung in the air, daughter. Suddenly, the crowd understood an additional layer to this story. "I'm sorry, sir," Sarah said, and she meant it for more than just the classified protection detail. She meant it for years of distance, for decisions made in anger, for paths chosen to prove points rather than find peace. But her father was shaking his head. "No, I'm the one who's sorry." His voice was rough with emotion. "I never saw you. Even when you were right in front of me, I never really saw what you were capable of." He did something then that Sarah had never seen him do in public. Something that went against every instinct of a senior military officer at a formal ceremony. He hugged her. The applause swelled again, more genuine this time, as father and daughter stood on that podium and bridged years of distance in a single embrace. The ceremony should have ended there, with the dramatic revelation, the emotional reunion, the perfect conclusion to a story about redemption and recognition. But Admiral Keene wasn't quite finished. As the applause died down and Admiral Mitchell returned to his seat, Still visibly shaken by the revelation that his own daughter had been protecting him for months without his knowledge, Admiral Keene's expression hardened into something more serious. The crowd sensed a shift in atmosphere. The celebratory mood that filled the ceremony grounds moments earlier began to give way to something more uncertain, more tense. Family members who had been smiling and applauding now watched with curiosity and growing concern. The SEALs who had been standing proudly in their dress whites now shifted their weight, some sensing that whatever was coming next might not be as celebratory as what had come before. "Now," Admiral Keene said, her voice cutting through the residual murmur conversation like a knife, "I need to address the reason I made a point of arriving here today in this manner. The reason I chose to reveal Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's service in such a public forum, despite the operational security concerns that doing so creates." She gestured for Sarah to remain at the podium beside her. Sarah felt completely exposed standing there, her carefully maintained cover blown to pieces in front of hundreds of witnesses, but she understood instinctively that this was part of something larger than her own comfort. Admiral Keene had a purpose, and Sarah was the instrument through which that purpose would be achieved. "The culture of special operations," Admiral Keene continued, her voice carrying across the silent grounds, "has always been built on a foundation of pushing limits, testing boundaries, and forging warriors who can operate in the most extreme conditions imaginable. This culture has produced some of the finest military personnel in the world. Warriors who protected our nation through countless conflicts, who have executed missions that most people will never know about, who have sacrificed more than most civilians can comprehend." She paused, letting that acknowledgement settle over the SEAL community present. It was important, Sarah realized, that Keene was beginning with respect rather than criticism. She was establishing that what came next wasn't an attack on the SEAL community itself, but rather a challenge to certain aspects of its culture. "But that same culture," Admiral Keene continued, her tone shifting subtly, "can also produce an environment where mockery replaces mentorship, where cruelty masquerades as toughness, and where the failure of others becomes entertainment rather than a learning opportunity." Sarah saw several SEALs shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some of the younger operators looked confused, unsure what this had to do with them, but others, particularly those who had been at Coronado during Sarah's training, were beginning to understand where this was heading. Jake Thornton was staring at the ground, his jaw clenched, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. "Over the past 8 months," Admiral Keene said, her voice remaining level but with steel underneath, "I've had multiple reports reach my desk about what happened after Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's medical withdrawal. Reports of jokes made at her expense in common areas of military installations. Stories spread through the special operations community, repeated and embellished with each telling. Comments made in public spaces, in gyms and dining facilities, in hallways where junior personnel could hear them, about the girl who couldn't hack it, the girl who quit, the girl who proved women don't belong in special operations." The silence in the ceremony grounds was now absolute. Even the sound of the ocean breeze seemed to have stilled. Family members were looking at their SEAL loved ones with new questions in their eyes. Other officers present were watching with expressions that ranged from approval to discomfort. Admiral Keene pulled out a tablet from her aide's hands. "I have documentation here. Transcript of conversations recorded in public spaces on military installations. Perfectly legal recordings, I should note, as these spaces are monitored for security purposes. I have sworn statements from junior personnel who witnessed these conversations and who reported feeling that the environment was hostile, unwelcoming, and contrary to the values they believed the military stood for." She looked up from the tablet, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Some of you may think these were harmless jokes among warriors letting off steam. Locker room talk. The kind of rough humor that's always been part of military culture, particularly in special operations. And I want to acknowledge that, yes, warriors do need to blow off steam. Yes, humor is an important coping mechanism in high-stress environments. Yes, there is a place for candid conversation among teammates." Admiral Keene's voice hardened. "But consider this. Every one of those jokes reached the ears of other women considering special operations careers. Every mocking comment became a data point for people making decisions about whether women belonged in these programs. Every story about Mitchell's failure was used as ammunition by those who want to keep special operations a closed club, who want to maintain barriers based on gender rather than capability. She let that sink in before continuing, her voice taking on even more gravity. And beyond the gender issue, which is significant and which we will address, there's a more fundamental question about what kind of culture we want to build in our special operations community. Do we want a culture where people who push themselves to medical collapse are mocked? Where legitimate medical withdrawals are treated as character flaws rather than the inevitable result of human physical limits? Where failing at one of the hardest training programs in the world makes you a joke rather than someone who at least had the courage to try? Sarah watched the faces in the crowd. Some people were nodding in agreement, particularly many of the family members and some of the more senior officers. But others looked defensive, resistant to what they were hearing. Change was never easy, especially in communities with strong traditions and established cultures. Admiral Keene turned to look directly at Jake Thornton and his team. Her gaze was not angry, Sarah noticed, but rather penetrating. The look of a senior leader who was about to hold people accountable for their actions. Senior Chief Thornton, would you and your team please step forward? The change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. What had been a celebratory ceremony honoring brave SEALs had suddenly transformed into something else entirely. A reckoning, a moment of accountability that no one had anticipated. Thornton and 5 of his teammates slowly, reluctantly, made their way to the area in front of the podium. Their earlier confidence completely evaporated, their faces registering varying degrees of concern, confusion, and dawning fear. Senior Chief, Admiral Keene said, her voice formal now, carrying the weight of command. 3 weeks ago, you received a commendation for actions during a classified operation in support of national security objectives. The commendation was deserved. You and your team performed admirably under difficult circumstances, demonstrated exceptional tactical proficiency, and achieved mission success despite numerous obstacles. Thornton nodded cautiously, unsure where this was going but sensing it wasn't anywhere good. His teammates stood at rigid attention, their military bearing perfect despite their obvious discomfort. However, Admiral Keene continued, and that single word seemed to echo across the ceremony grounds. I've also reviewed extensive documentation, transcript of conversations you've had over the past 8 months regarding Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. Conversations that occurred in public spaces, on military installations. Conversations that were overheard by junior personnel, by civilians working on base, by other officers. Conversations that were, technically, regarding another officer's service record and medical history. Information that should have been treated with discretion and respect. Sarah saw Thornton's face lose what little color it had left. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. He was beginning to understand exactly how much trouble he was in. In the civilian world, Admiral Keene said, her voice cutting and precise, what you did might be called bullying or harassment. We have employment laws against creating hostile work environments, against mocking people for medical conditions, against using someone's protected characteristics as the basis for ridicule. She paused. In the military, we have different terms. We call it conduct unbecoming an officer, or in your case, a senior enlisted leader. We call it failure to treat fellow service members with respect. We call it creating a hostile environment that undermines unit cohesion and degrades the professional atmosphere we require for mission success. She pulled a folder from her aide, who had materialized beside her with perfect timing. The folder was official-looking, bearing the seals of both the Department of Defense and the Naval Special Warfare Command. Senior Chief Thornton, you and the 5 members of your team who participated in publicly mocking Lieutenant Commander Mitchell are hereby issued formal letters of counseling. These letters will become part of your permanent service records. They will be considered during any future advancement or selection processes, including selection for Senior Chief, for Master Chief, for any special assignments, and for any positions requiring exemplary conduct records. The crowd had gone completely silent. Letters of counseling weren't the harshest punishment the military could issue. There were letters of reprimand, non-judicial punishment, courts-martial, and other more severe consequences. But for SEALs who prided themselves on having spotless records, who competed for elite positions where every evaluation mattered, who understood that their reputation was everything in a small community, these letters were devastating. Sarah could see the impact rippling through Thornton's team. One of them looked like he might be sick. Another's hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Thornton himself seemed to have aged 10 years in the span of 30 seconds. Furthermore, Admiral Keene continued, and if possible her voice became even more formal, even more severe. You are all required to complete a series of workshops on leadership, respect, and professional conduct. These workshops will be conducted by NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and will be fully documented. Your attendance will be mandatory. Your participation will be evaluated. Your completion of these workshops will be required before you can be considered for any promotions, selections, or special assignments. She held up another document. Additionally, you will each write a formal letter of apology to Lieutenant Commander Mitchell to be reviewed by your chain of command before delivery. These letters will acknowledge your conduct, explain your understanding of why it was inappropriate, and detail the steps you are taking to ensure such behavior never happens again. Thornton looked like he wanted to protest, to argue, to defend himself, but he knew better than to speak. His teammates looked equally stricken, their faces reflecting shock, shame, anger at themselves, and fear about what this might mean for their careers. I want to be absolutely clear, Admiral Keene said, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its authority. This is not about revenge. This is not about punishing you for Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's benefit, or about making an example of you to score political points. This is about maintaining standards that apply to everyone who wears this uniform, regardless of rank, regardless of how many decorations you've earned, regardless of how many successful missions you've completed. She gestured toward the assembled crowd. You are SEALs, warriors who represent the very best of our military. You are held to the highest standards of physical fitness, tactical proficiency, and operational excellence. But being a warrior is not just about physical prowess or combat skills or the ability to execute high-risk missions. It's about character. It's about integrity. It's about honor. And character includes how you treat people, especially those who may have stumbled or fallen or taken a different path than you did. Admiral Keene turned to look at Sarah, and there was something almost paternal in her expression. Pride mixed with protectiveness. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell is an exceptional officer. She has proven herself in ways that most people in this audience will never know about, completing missions that remain classified, protecting principles at the highest levels of government, demonstrating skills that combine the best of conventional and unconventional warfare. But here's the thing I want you all to understand. Even if she weren't exceptional, even if she had simply washed out training and taken a desk job and never done anything remarkable afterward, she would still have deserved your respect. The Admiral's voice rose slightly, carrying a passion that had been contained until now. She would have deserved your respect because she tried, because she pushed herself to the absolute breaking point, because she was willing to risk failure in pursuit of excellence, because she raised her hand and volunteered for one of the hardest challenges our military offers, knowing that most people who attempt it fail, knowing that she might fail, but believing that the attempt was worth making. She looked back at Thornton and his team. That kind of courage, the courage to try even when failure is likely, the courage to push yourself past your limits, the courage to risk public humiliation in pursuit of a goal, that deserves respect. Not mockery, not jokes, not stories told to make yourself feel superior by comparison. Admiral Keene closed the folder with a decisive snap. That is all I have to say on this matter. Senior Chief Thornton, you and your team are dismissed. Report to your Command Master Chief within 24 hours to begin processing these counseling letters. Your workshop schedule will be provided within 72 hours. You have your orders. They filed away, their earlier swagger completely gone. Their heads no longer held quite as high. Their families watched with expressions ranging from confusion to disappointment to anger. Sarah saw one SEAL's wife grab her husband's arm, her face demanding answers he clearly didn't want to give. She saw another teammate's father, himself obviously a veteran judging by his bearing, shake his head with what looked like deep disappointment. The ceremony concluded shortly afterward, though the mood had fundamentally shifted. The base commander returned to the podium to deliver closing remarks, but they felt almost anticlimactic after what had just occurred. The benediction was given. The colors were retired, and the formal portion of the event was declared complete. People mingled afterward, as is customary at military ceremonies, but the conversations were different now. Some were energized by what they'd witnessed, a rare moment of accountability, of justice being served, of a senior leader actually addressing toxic behavior rather than sweeping it under the rug. Others were uncomfortable, uncertain how to process what had happened, worried about the implications for their own behavior or their own units. Sarah found herself surrounded by people wanting to congratulate her, shake her hand, hear her story in her own words. It was overwhelming after months of operating in the shadows, of being invisible by design, of carefully maintaining a cover that allowed her to do her job without drawing attention. A young female officer, Sarah guessed she was maybe 24 or 25, approached with tears in her eyes. "Ma'am, I just want to say thank you. I've been thinking about trying out for special operations, but everyone kept telling me I wasn't tough enough, that I wouldn't make it, that I should stick to traditional roles. What you did, what Admiral Keene said today, it matters. It really matters." Sarah squeezed the young woman's hand. "Don't let anyone else define your limits. Try. Even if you fail, you'll learn something valuable about yourself. And you might not fail at all." An older SEAL approached next, a Master Chief with more years of service than Sarah had been alive. "Ma'am, I want to apologize on behalf of the community. Not all of us felt that way about your withdrawal. Some of us knew it took guts just to try." He glanced toward where Thornton had disappeared. "And some of us are glad to see accountability finally happening for behavior that's been tolerated too long." But through it all, Sarah kept glancing toward one specific person. Her father was waiting for her, standing apart from the others, his expression still processing everything he'd learned in the past hour. Admiral James Mitchell, who had spent his entire career in the Navy, who had risen to the highest ranks, who had commanded ships and task forces, and now oversaw special operations integration, looked lost in a way Sarah had never seen before. When the crowd finally thinned, when the well-wishers had said their pieces and drifted away to their own conversations, Sarah made her way to where her father stood. "I have questions," he said simply, his voice rougher than usual. "I imagine you do, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining the formal address because she wasn't sure yet what their relationship was in this moment. "Can we talk?" "Somewhere private." They found a quiet office in the administration building, the same building where Jake Thornton had mocked her months earlier, where she collected her belongings after a medical withdrawal, where she felt the weight of failure and humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Her father sat down heavily in one of the chairs, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. The ramrod-straight posture he'd maintained throughout his career seemed to have softened, as if the revelations of the day had physically affected his bearing. Start at the beginning. Help me understand how I had my own daughter protecting me for months without recognizing her. So she did. She told him about the medical withdrawal, about lying in that hospital bed, feeling like she'd failed everyone who'd ever believed in her. She told him about the humiliation of walking through the base, hearing the whispers, seeing the smirks, becoming a cautionary tale and a punchline. She told him about the phone call from Admiral Keene's program, a voice she'd never heard before asking if she wanted to try again, differently this time. She told him about the 8 months that followed, the training at a facility that didn't exist on any map, the languages she learned, the skills she acquired, the mission she completed. She told him about the moment she was assigned to a protection detail, about recognizing him without him recognizing her, about the surreal experience of guarding his life while he treated her as just another junior officer in the background. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked when she finished, and there was genuine pain in his voice. "Even after you were assigned to my detail, you could have found a way to let me know. We could have had something, some kind of relationship beyond you being my anonymous bodyguard. Could I have?" Sarah asked quietly, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have thought I was making excuses, exaggerating my role, trying to salvage pride after failing at something I'd set out to do? Would you have seen me as your daughter who'd accomplished something extraordinary, or as the daughter who couldn't cut it as a SEAL and was making up stories to feel better about herself?" Her father flinched as if she'd struck him. "Is that really what you think of me? That I'm so rigid, so judgmental, so incapable of seeing nuance that I couldn't have been proud of what you accomplished. I think, Sarah said carefully, choosing her word with precision, that you had a very specific vision of what success looked like. SEALs, combat operations, the conventional path that you walked, that your peers walked, that the military has recognized and celebrated for decades. And when I couldn't walk that path, when my body gave out and I had to be medically withdrawn, I wasn't sure there was any other path you'd respect, any other form of service you'd value. The silence that followed was heavy with years of misunderstanding, of assumptions made and never questioned, of distances that had grown wider without either of them fully realizing it. I was wrong, Admiral Mitchell finally said simply, about so many things, about what strength looks like, about what it means to serve, about what makes someone worthy of respect, about you. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of years of misunderstanding and distance hanging between them like a physical presence. I owe you an apology, Admiral Mitchell finally said, his voice carrying a vulnerability Sarah had never heard before. Not just for this, for not recognizing you, for not seeing what was right in front of me, but for your entire career, for your entire life. Really? I pushed you toward a specific vision of service because it was what I knew, what I valued, what had worked for me. But I never asked what you wanted, what you needed, what would make you feel fulfilled rather than just successful by my definition of success. I wanted to prove I could do it, Sarah admitted, her own voice softening as the formal barriers between them began to crumble. The SEAL training. I wanted it so badly. And yes, part of it was proving it to myself. But a bigger part was proving it to you. Showing everyone that I was tough enough, strong enough, good enough. That I wasn't just your daughter trading on your name, but a warrior in my own right. You are tough enough, her father said firmly, leaning forward with an intensity she remembered from childhood, from the rare moments when he'd been fully present. You always were. But toughness isn't just about enduring pain or pushing through physical limits or completing the hardest training program. It's also about adapting when circumstances change, about finding new paths when old ones close. About having the courage to start over when the world tells you failed. That takes a different kind of strength, maybe an even greater strength than just grinding through a predetermined path. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the base where he'd spent so much of his career, where Sarah had tried and failed and then, unbeknownst to everyone, succeeded in ways that couldn't be measured by conventional metrics. You know what I realized today, watching Admiral Keene reveal who you are, what you've done? I've been so focused on traditional measures of success, on the ribbons and the rank and the positions that everyone recognizes, that I couldn't see the extraordinary thing happening right in front of me. My daughter was protecting me, keeping me safe, doing a job that required skills and dedication I can barely comprehend. And I was so blind, so convinced I knew what excellence looked like, that I didn't even recognize her. Sarah felt tears threatening but fought them back, maintaining the composure she'd learned in her training. Admiral Keene destroying my cover like that, it's going to change everything. I can't go back to executive protection now. Everyone knows who I am, knows about the program, knows what I can do. My effectiveness as an invisible operator is completely gone. Maybe that's not a bad thing, her father said, turning to face her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Maybe it's time for you to step out of the shadows. Maybe it's time for stories like yours to be told, for people to understand that there are many paths to excellence, many ways to serve. Admiral Keene clearly thinks so, or she wouldn't have orchestrated today's events the way she did. He was probably right. Admiral Keene's dramatic revelation had been calculated, intentional, carefully planned. She was making a statement not just about Sarah, but about the program itself, about what was possible, about breaking down barriers that had existed for generations. What will you do now? Her father asked. I don't know, Sarah admitted honestly. Admiral Keene will have a plan. She always does. She doesn't make moves like today without thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead. But my career just changed trajectory in a major way, and I'm not entirely sure where it's heading. Whatever you decide, her father said, and his voice carried a weight of emotion that made Sarah's throat tighten. I want you to know something. I'm proud of you. Not because you completed some theoretical version of training I valued, not because you checked boxes on a career path I'd mapped out for you, but because you found your own path. You turned what looked like failure into something extraordinary. You adapted. You persevered. You found a way to serve that matched your capabilities instead of forcing yourself into a mold that didn't quite fit. That takes more courage than I gave you credit for. More courage than I think I ever had. It was perhaps the most her father had ever said to her about his feelings. The most vulnerable he'd ever been. The most honest he'd been about his own limitations as a parent and a mentor. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, and the tears she'd been fighting finally escaped, tracking down her cheeks. "That means more than you know. More than I can probably express right now." They talked for another hour after that, filling in gaps, rebuilding bridges, finding their way towards something that resembled understanding. Sarah told him about specific missions she completed, at least the parts that weren't classified. Her father told her about watching her grow up from a distance, about regretting all the deployments he'd chosen, about wishing he'd been present for more of her life. It wasn't a complete healing. That would take time, many more conversations, years of building trust and relearning how to be family to each other. But it was a start. It was more than they'd had in years. When Sarah finally left the administration building, the sun was setting over Coronado, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold and purple. Most of the ceremony attendees had dispersed, heading to their various celebrations or homes or hotel rooms. The ceremony grounds were empty now except for the cleanup crew breaking down chairs and removing decorations. But Admiral Keene was waiting by her helicopter, her security detail maintaining their positions but giving her space, understanding that she needed a private moment for whatever was about to happen. "That was quite a day," Sarah said as she approached, her voice carrying exhaustion and relief and something like wonder. "Necessary," Admiral Keene replied simply, her tone brooking no doubt. "We've been having conversations at the highest levels, Joint Chiefs, SSDF, even the White House, about bringing some of our programs into the light. Not everything, obviously. Much of what we do must remain classified for operational effectiveness. But the existence of these programs, the capabilities we developed, the talent we recruited from unconventional sources, it's time for that to be acknowledged. Time for the military and the public to understand that special operations is broader and more diverse than the popular image suggests. And I'm your proof of concept." Sarah asked, understanding dawning, "The face of this new transparency?" "You're one of them," the Admiral confirmed. "Your story is powerful, Sarah. It challenges assumptions about failure and success. It shows possibilities that people haven't considered. And yes, it makes certain people uncomfortable, people who need to be uncomfortable if we're going to evolve as a military and as a society." Sarah glanced back toward the administration building, where she left her father still processing everything. What happens to Thornton and his team? Really? Beyond the letters of counseling. "They'll learn from this or they won't," Admiral Keene said pragmatically, her expression neutral. "The letters of counseling are real, and they will have consequences for their careers. But I'm not interested in destroying careers or crushing people for mistakes. I'm interested in changing culture, in setting new standards, in making it clear that certain behaviors won't be tolerated anymore. Sometimes it requires making examples, but the goal is growth, not punishment. If they learn and adapt, they can have long and successful careers. If they don't," she shrugged, "then they'll face natural consequences." She handed Sarah a folder, thick with documents and marked with classification stamps. "Your next assignment. You're being transferred to the training side of our program. We're expanding significantly. There's funding, there's support from senior leadership, and there's recognition that we need to cast a wider net in how we recruit and develop special operations talent. We need instructors who understand both the conventional and unconventional paths to special operations. People who can identify talent that doesn't fit the standard mold. People who walk both paths themselves." Sarah opened a folder, scanning the details. It was a promotion to full commander, a position at a new training facility, an opportunity to shape the next generation of operators who would come from backgrounds as diverse as their skills. It was She realized exactly what she would have chosen if given the option. "What about my father?" she asked, practical concerns intruding on her excitement. "His protection detail? Who takes over?" "Already handled," Admiral Keene said with a slight smile. "He'll have a new executive protection officer starting Monday. Someone excellent, though not his daughter this time. He knows to expect a transition." Her smile widened slightly. "Though I suspect he's going to be considerably more aware of the people protecting him from now on, more appreciative of what they do and the skills they bring." The helicopter's rotors began to spin up, the familiar whine building to the thump-thump-thump that had announced Keene's arrival hours earlier. The Admiral's security detail moved into their positions, efficient and professional, preparing for departure. "One more thing, Sarah," the Admiral said over the growing noise, her voice raised but still carrying clearly. "Today wasn't just about you, as much as it might have felt like it. It was about every person who's been told they're not good enough, not strong enough, not the right fit for the roles they want to pursue. It was about showing that there are many paths to excellence, that failure in one area doesn't define your worth, that adaptation is a strength rather than a weakness. Don't forget that as you move forward into this new role, you're not just training operators, you're changing minds and opening doors." Sarah came to attention and saluted, the gesture crisp and formal despite the emotional weight of the day. Admiral Keene returned it before boarding the helicopter. Within minutes, the aircraft lifted off, banking toward the east in the setting sun, its navigation lights beginning to glow as twilight approached. Sarah stood alone on the landing zone, feeling the weight of the day settle over her like a physical presence. Her cover was blown, completely and irrevocably. Her relationship with her father had shifted fundamentally, opening possibilities she thought were long dead. Her career was taking a new direction toward training and leadership rather than operational work. The carefully constructed life she'd built over the past 8 months was gone. Everything had changed. But as she walked back toward her car, her mind already beginning to process all the implications and plan for what came next, she realized something else. She was no longer the girl who quit. She wasn't defined by that one moment of physical collapse, by the mockery that had followed, by the assumptions people had made about her capabilities and her worth. She was Commander Sarah Mitchell now. The promotion in that folder was effective immediately. An officer who'd taken an unexpected path and found extraordinary purpose. An instructor who would help others find their own paths, whether conventional or not. A daughter reconnecting with a father who'd finally learned to see her clearly, to value her for who she was rather than who he'd wanted her to be. The story that had started with humiliation and failure had become something else entirely. Not because the failure hadn't been real, it had been brutally so. Not because the pain and shame hadn't been genuine. They had been cutting deep and leaving scars that hadn't fully healed. But because failure had never been the end of the story. It had only been the beginning. 3 months later, Commander Sarah Mitchell stood in front of her first class of recruits at the newly expanded training facility. The building still smelled of fresh paint and new construction. The equipment was state-of-the-art. The curriculum she'd helped develop was revolutionary, combining the best of conventional special operations training with new methodologies for identifying and developing unconventional talent. The 30 recruits standing before her were as diverse as the program's new vision. Men and women various ages, different racial and ethnic backgrounds, coming from conventional military units and civilian sectors alike. Some had washed out of other special operations programs. Some had never tried the conventional route. Some had capabilities that didn't fit standard special operations profiles, but that were desperately needed in modern warfare. Some of you are here because you failed at something else, Sarah told them, her voice carrying clearly across the training bay. You washed out of SEAL training or Ranger school or Special Forces qualification. You didn't meet a physical standard, or you couldn't complete a specific evolution. Or you took a career path that didn't work out the way you'd hoped. Some of you are here because you never tried the conventional route in the first place. You knew it wasn't for you, and you were looking for alternatives that would let you serve in ways that matched your unique capabilities. She walked along the line of recruits, seeing their nervousness, their determination, their hope mixed with fear. She saw herself in many of their faces, the uncertainty about whether they belonged, the worry about failing again, the desperate desire to prove something to themselves and others. I'm here to tell you that your unconventional path is not a weakness, Sarah continued. It's a strength. It's a feature, not a bug. The fact that you're willing to try something different, to challenge assumptions about what special operations can look like, to persist even after you've been told you don't fit, that takes courage. Maybe more courage than following the well-worn path that everyone recognizes and celebrates. Sarah stopped in front of a young woman who looked particularly nervous, her hands clenched at her sides, her jaw tight with tension. You're going to face people who doubt you. People who think you took the easy way out, or that you're not a real operator because you didn't follow the traditional route. You're going to hear jokes about your past, assumptions about your capabilities, questions about whether you belong here at all. She looked at each recruit in turn, making eye contact, letting them see the conviction in her expression. Here's what I want you to remember, what I want you to internalize so deeply that no amount of mockery or doubt can shake it. Excellence comes in many forms. Strength is not one-dimensional, and the person who can adapt, who can find new paths when old ones close, who can turn failure into a foundation for growth, that person is often more valuable in modern operations than the person who simply excelled at the standard test. One of the recruits, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, raised his hand tentatively. Commander, is it true? That story about you and the SEAL ceremony? The helicopter landing? The Admiral calling out those guys who mocked you? Sarah smiled, the memory still vivid despite 3 months having passed. Every word. And I'm here today because of that story, not in spite of it, but because of it. My path led me here, to this moment, to teaching all of you. If I completed SEAL training conventionally, I'd probably be deployed somewhere right now, doing important work, but not this work. This work, helping you find your paths, developing new methodologies for special operations, challenging old assumptions. This is where I'm supposed to be. She gestured toward the training complex behind her, the buildings and obstacle courses, and specialized facilities that would test these recruits in ways both familiar and entirely new. This program is hard, harder than most conventional special operations training in some ways, because we're asking you to develop capabilities that go beyond just physical endurance and tactical proficiency. Some of you won't complete it. That's okay. Completion isn't the only measure of success here. Trying is success. Pushing your limits is success. Learning what you're capable of, even if that means discovering your limits, is success. As she dismissed the recruits to begin their first training evolution, Sarah thought about how far she'd come from that pool deck at Coronado. From a moment her body had given out and her dreams had seemed to shatter into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. The girl who quit had become the woman who persevered, who adapted, who found new paths when old ones closed. And that, Sarah realized as she watched her recruits begin their journey, made all the difference. Not the failure itself, but what came after. Not the falling, but the getting back up. Not the end of one dream, but the beginning of something bigger.